Are we live yet?
Yes, we are.
Okay. Would you like me to start?
Please do.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to our conference, A Prophet is Not Known in Her Town, or Symposium, Conversations on Visionary Women. We are now at the point of our second panel for the day. And before we get started, I just want to thank our presenters from yesterday evening and today for such wonderful discussion. Between the panels, I had the opportunity to go outside. It is an absolutely gorgeous day here in Chicago. I don't know about where you are. And I was so grateful. It was wonderful to reflect on what everybody has been saying. And I just want to say thank you. I'm so grateful to be part of this really beautiful, life-giving discussion. And so that brings us then to our panelists for the Women Leading in Media discussion. These are fantastic presenters representing a range of experiences from mainstream media to religious journalism to spiritual writing. So let me introduce you to them. Just one more thing. I wanted to, before I bring them to you, reflect on what Sister Carol said yesterday about how before we can really speak of and think about hope, we must name the reality. And as soon as she said that, I thought about our panel of journalists today and how that responsibility is something that's really left to them and how important it is. Before we can have a conversion of consciousness, as we talked about yesterday and this morning, we have to have a sense of what our reality is. We have to be able to see it and see it together. And so with that, let me introduce you to these very accomplished women. Jessica Mesman is Associate Editor of the Christian Century and author of 4 books, including Love and Salt, which she co-authored with her friend and won the Christopher Award for Literature. Her essays and journalism have appeared in America, U.S. Catholic, Christianity Today, Elle, Vox, LitHub, and others. And I just want to underscore how exciting this is because she's just started her job at Christian Century. Heidi Schlumpf is executive editor of the National Catholic Reporter, where she previously served as its national correspondent. She has 3 decades of experience covering religion, spirituality, social justice, and women's issues. She is also the author of 3 books, including a biography of feminist theologian Elizabeth Johnson. Next is Judith Valente, who started her career in journalism as a staff writer for the Washington Post, and then she went to the Wall Street Journal. She's been twice a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Journalism in both public service and feature writing. So she eventually switches to broadcast journalism with her career at PBS TV, and she was a Chicago correspondent for America Magazine. She is the author of 4 incredible books, 2 of which I just finished reading, including How to Live, and collections of poetry. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the panel over to these presenters. Would either one of you like to start off, or shall we go in the order that I just laid out? Okay, Jessica, why don't you go ahead? You need to unmute, Jessica.
I'm really glad that you said what you said about recalling what Sister Carol said about naming the reality before we can speak to hope, because I'm going to talk today about some of the reality of my experiences in Catholic media in particular. So I want to share about my own experience, but first I have to talk about one of the visionary women who inspired me in the first place, who is Maisie Ward. She was half of the Catholic publishing house Sheed and Ward, which was responsible for many of the great Catholic books of nonfiction of the mid-20th century. The other half was her husband, Frank, and this was probably how she got away with being a woman in power in Catholic publishing at that time. Maisie and Frank, as Sheed and Ward, were distinctively Catholic, but unashamedly literary. Maisie wrote a bio of Chesterton, but also of Robert Browning. Their literary and theological standards were high, but you didn't have to be a theologian or a philosopher to appreciate their publication list of deeply Catholic titles. They published many of the books that I keep near me at all times, including titles by my other Catholic writing hero, the British mystic Caryll Houselander. Importantly, I think Maisie and Frank were not American. Maisie was a British daughter of the Oxford movement, and Frank was Australian. But when they opened their publishing house in America, they hoped to at least shade in the outlines of the kind of Catholicism America seemed to be missing, to encourage an ongoing intellectual tradition that wasn't limited to the academy or the institutional church, but extended to the interested laity, including women. Maisie's son said that his parents set out to serve the incurably brainy Catholic and to give them a place to repair. He said their books were intended to keep those kinds of people Catholic. So when I first started out as a writer and editor for literary magazines, I was often the only Catholic in the room. And I hungered for the kinds of books that Sheed and Ward had published. But when I compared a book like Caryll Houselander's This War is the Passion to the soft-focused sentimentality and the panicked screeds on most Catholic bookstore shelves, I was perplexed, to say the least. What had happened to Sheed and Ward? Who was publishing work for the Catholic artists, the poets, the incurably brainy? Who is doing that now? And who is keeping us Catholic? When I sold my first book to a Catholic publisher, they warned me that it was too highbrow. But Love and Salt was a book of letters that I had written with a friend, Amy Alsnauer, another writer, while she was converting to Catholicism. It did require a bibliography, but it was really just a conversation between friends about the struggle to believe. And the publishing house liked it enough to buy it and set about trying to make it appeal to women readers, Catholic women readers, they said, by giving it a pink cover that belied that it was really a book about theodicy. Catholic publishing didn't seem to know what to do with such a book, one written by women who spoke casually about Hegel and then recounted the trouble of washing out your bangs in the sink to avoid being late for work. But we found that those who read the book and are still reading it now loved it. Our audience was narrow, but it was passionate. I could tell you hours of stories, literally, of my negative experiences in Catholic media and publishing. How I was grilled at a job interview at a Catholic magazine about what kind of a Catholic I was, and then clearly gave the wrong answer. How an editor at a publishing house rejected my book and then accepted it when a man submitted the very same book with his name attached. But unlike many of my contemporaries who shied away from being branded as Catholic writers, I refuse to do that. I am a Catholic. I'm a writer. And I write mostly about being Catholic. And people seem to think that I had some talent and ability. So to be unable to find a home within Catholic publishing was extremely discouraging. So with Maisie Ward and Caryll Houselander in mind, I started my own thing, a blog called Sick Pilgrim. Surely it wasn't just me, I kept thinking. If I throw up the soapbox, someone else will show up. And you know who we ended up attracting? A lot of Catholics who were sick to death of what Catholic publishing and online media was serving. Not just women, but men and non-binary folks, LGBTQ folks, folks struggling with depression and trauma who felt nobody really saw them in the church or listened to their stories and questions. Those who were tired of being told again and again there was only one way to be Catholic, and definitely only one way to be a Catholic woman, especially in the media. Among our contributors, we eventually counted monks and nuns, religious sisters, but we also had atheists, established writers, and first-time writers. We published a series of true stories by Catholic women trying and failing at NFP, allowing them to write anonymously because so many feared online retaliation and potential banishment in their home parishes. We also published a series of short literary essays called Approaching Mystery, which included work from prominent secular writers and first-time Catholic writers, somehow inspiring and encouraging each other to look more closely at how the great mystery moved in their lives. We published the Dark Devotional every Friday, which invited all kinds of writers from different faiths and backgrounds to meditate truthfully on what that weekend's lectionary readings meant to them, even if what it meant was challenging, which it almost always was. And I was really proud that some of our most loyal fans were not Catholics, but people who admired our church from afar, sometimes against their better judgment. They seemed to sense that the Catholic Church was the repository of some great and irresistible mystery, even if it repulsed them. We gave them a space where they felt comfortable exploring that attraction. We threw open the doors and let them, as Maisie Ward's son once described it, raid our church for treasures. But Sikh Pilgrim was shorter lived than I dreamed it would be. My life changed drastically during that time. I got divorced, and I could no longer afford to work for free at what had been an all-volunteer labor of love, what I had considered my ministry. But instead of my experience and success with Sikh Pilgrim making me a desirable candidate for more work in Catholic media, I found that my work there had cemented my position as an outsider and even as a dissenter. When my colleague was exposed and immediately fired from Sikh Pilgrim by me for spiritually abusing a woman writer who had joined our online community, our forthcoming book was immediately canceled by our Catholic publisher. And I agreed with that decision, though I hoped I would have an opportunity to publish my parts of the book, which our editor had told us from the beginning were better written, though my male colleagues' lesser contribution inexplicably made it more appealing to a wider readership. But the publisher never spoke to me again, even though I had published 3 previous books with them. I was, in fact, told that any correspondence from me should be directed to the president of the company, not to my editor who I had worked with for 7 years. They were legally bound not to speak to me. I felt like a criminal. Among the other work I lost during that period, all from Catholic publications, I was also fired from the conference I had helped to establish for Catholic writers, journalists, and scholars outside the academy, which was held at the University of Notre Dame. The man who dismissed me, who came late to work for that conference that Sikh Pilgrim had made a success, told me they could no longer collaborate with me on conference planning because Sikh Pilgrim now had unsavory connotations. But he did invite me to submit a panel proposal, which he would graciously consider. I was desolate. I felt I was being abandoned and shunned for doing the right thing, and it was a huge betrayal. Also during this season, another priest abuse scandal broke. Trump was elected, aided in part by white Catholic voters. My parish priest began to preach white nationalism from the pulpit. I was in a long, dark night of the soul, wondering if this meant I wasn't really Catholic at all, despite my baptism and confirmation, despite what I believed, what I felt, and what I claimed. I even began to wonder if by attracting people to the Catholic Church, I had done the wrong thing. I'd written about the church as my sanctuary in this world, a place to be fed, nurtured, forgiven, and healed. But was that really true? By talking up all these mystical treasures of Catholicism, had I actually been complicit in perpetuating the smoke and mirrors that enable abuse? Suddenly, all of my writing work was coming from mainline Protestants. My writing group was my lifeline, and it was populated with women who were Episcopal priests and UCC pastors, and former Roman Catholics and ex-evangelicals who loved and supported me through that time. I was back to being the only Catholic in the room, and I had been just as I had been in the literary publishing world. I love those people, but it felt like I'd been exiled. Even my old heroes, Maisie Ward and Carol Houselander, offered no comfort. All I could think was that Maisie Ward had a supportive husband for a business partner and came from a family of wealthy, respected Catholic intellectuals. She was best friends, literally, with men like Chesterton and Belloc. She was Catholic royalty. And Carol had Maisie, who championed her work and protected her when she felt fragile. Those 5 years were the most challenging of my life, spiritually and emotionally. And I say that as someone whose mother died when she was 14. I stopped going to Mass, and I felt creatively empty without the church. I felt like I didn't know myself anymore and doubted my vocation to ministry, to creative people who were suffering, thirsting, and on the margins of acceptance. Basically, I gave up. I started looking for jobs at libraries and schools and nonprofits, thinking a career change was inevitable and necessary and even healthy. But then I was invited to apply for this position at the Christian Century. And 2 weeks ago, I started a full-time job as associate editor. And again, I'm the only Catholic in the room. The Christian Century has been around for more than a century, and it is the flagship magazine for mainline Protestantism in America. They were the original magazine to publish Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. They were also the original publishers of the offensive pastor statement that inspired King to write the letter in the first place. I feel like I've landed in a place that is open to being corrected and committed to supporting and publishing prophetic voices, even those that might feel threatening to the status quo, especially those voices. It's really early to say, but I feel hopeful and energized again, even if I am the only Catholic on staff. Listening to Sister Carol last night and Mara's response to her on the panel this morning, I feel encouraged for the first time in a very long time to be on the margins of a church that doesn't seem to want what I have to give. I was reminded that my discomfort in my own church might be a holy discomfort. And to be on the edge of that raft, but still holding on, may be exactly the right place for me. Thank you.
Jessica, thank you so much. It is really, I'm sure I speak for a lot of people to say it is heartbreaking to hear about how you've been treated. I think it's just a miracle that you're still with us in this community, in this church. And I hope, if anything, from today's discussion, you have a sense that if you do feel marginal in this church, that you feel like you have a community of people who want you there. So thank you. That took a lot of courage. Now I'm going to turn it over to Heidi Schlumpf.
Thank you, Michelle. And thank you, Jessica and Judith, for both being on this panel with me. These are women whose books are on my shelves and who I know from our shared crossing paths. Jessica, I remember you telling me the story of the sexual assaults and me being able to report about that. So we're all connected, but I'm really excited to share part of my story as well. So it's hard to believe, but it was a week ago. I was just finishing a well-deserved and socially distanced happy hour when my husband called, and he doesn't usually call, he's a texter. And I picked up the phone and he called to tell me that Ruth Bader Ginsburg had died. And my heart sunk, as I'm sure many of you can relate. The very next night, I organized a required family viewing of the RBG documentary for my two children, my husband and me. And there was one quote that stood out to me that was mentioned in the documentary, but also you can find it emblazoned on mugs and t-shirts and everywhere. So Ruth said, "Women belong in all places where decisions are being made." And the second sentence was, "It shouldn't be that women are the exception." But talking about the time that when she was the only woman on the Supreme Court for a brief moment. So she was referring to the Supreme Court, but this is also applicable right in our church, where, as Sister Carol noted last night, 1% of the church as ordained ministers hold most of the power. And sadly, this has been my experience too in Catholic media and as a woman in the media more generally. I don't know if you've ever seen that meme going around that asks, how old were you when you had your first Black teacher? Or I think it might have even said Black male teacher. For me, and my children are astonished by this, it wasn't until I was in graduate school. But that meme made me think about my own journalistic education. I never had a female journalism teacher. So I went to the University of Notre Dame, where we did not have a journalism major, but I was in the American Studies program where you could take a number of journalism classes. I then, after working for a while, I went back for a master's in theological studies from Garrett Evangelical, which is part of Northwestern. And at the time they offered a joint master's degree, and I was not trying to get both masters, but you could take a number of classes in religion journalism. And while I've had many wonderful women colleagues, I have never worked full-time for a publication with a female editor at the top until now. And I am the female editor at the top. So I started out at a daily newspaper in California where all of the editors were men, except for the editor of the food section. Then I moved to Chicago and I worked at the Archdiocesan newspaper here in Chicago, where the managing editor was a woman, but the top editors were men, including one was a priest. Then I went to U.S. Catholic Magazine, which is a wonderful progressive magazine with lay leadership, but technically the editor at the top of the masthead is a Claretian priest. And my editor-in-chief who hired me was also a man, although he was a feminist man. When I came to the National Catholic Reporter, I'd been a columnist for a while. And as Michelle said, I was national correspondent and then eventually moved into editing. All the top editors, or the managing editor again was a female, but the top editor was male. In fact, in NCR's 56-year history, I'm only the second top female editor at NCR. A religious woman, Sister Rita, was editor back in the early 2000s. Even as a freelancer, and I've written for a number of other publications, I've had very few female editors, except, and I remembered this exception, at Publishers Weekly, where the top editor was a woman. I've learned a lot from the male editors that I've had, and many of them were great. I've also been on the receiving end of a lot of sexism on the part of the male editors I've worked for. I remember in one newsroom having a lot of comments on my looks, and the city editor once said that my butt looked good in that skirt. I also had a conversation, I shared this in a column I wrote this week, where I found out that the two male colleagues of mine with similar experience were making several thousand more dollars a year than I was. And when I challenged the editor about that, he pointed out that I was married and my income was secondary to my husband's. This was in the 1990s. So journalism, unfortunately, I think is still very much a man's world. And according to some research that I did at Pointer, which is a professional development for journalists, a website and an organization, it's kind of flatlining, unlike other industries where women are getting more and more of the top jobs. And even more discouraging, it seems that many women are choosing to major in journalism in school with this dream or desire, perhaps, of being in the industry. In fact, 2/3 of journalism grads are women, according to a survey from 2017, but only 1/3 of newsroom staffs are women. So we don't know the answer why. Are they leaving? Are they pushed out? Do they, hit the glass ceiling? Do they find that it's incompatible with family life? I think all of us can probably tell you that it's not a 9-to-5 job. That same report said that at the time, again, and I think the data was from 2016, men had 62% of bylines in print, online, TV, and wire news, and had won 84% of the Pulitzer Prizes in the last century. Well, after all my decades in a little bit of secular, but mostly religious and Catholic journalism, I'm here to say it's really not that different in Catholic and religious journalism. And it may even be worse, in part because of the clericalism. So, for example, publications that are connected with the religious order directly, for example, America, which is owned and operated by the Jesuits, or U.S. Catholic, where I used to work, which is owned and operated by the Claretians. There's a history of a priest being the editor, if not having more, like America has a number of other Jesuits who also work for the magazine. Even when women are in leadership in Catholic publications, they tend to be in other positions. At NCR, we have a number of women who work in various parts of the business side. In fact, I think they dominate on that side, but the editorial side was still pretty heavily male. I recently had the chance to reach out to a couple of other editors for a shared project, and I was excited to see that there are actually some women editors out there. Our Sunday Visitor currently has a female editor, Gretchen Crow, and the National Catholic Register, with whom the National Catholic Reporter is sometimes mistaken, and we're very different. So the Register is owned by EWTN. They have a top female editor right now too, Jeanette DeMello. And I know that Sojourner's also named an executive editor, a woman, Sanda Villarreal, right around the same time I was named this past spring. Also, in secular religion coverage, we have a lot of prominent women. And I was just, at the same time as this conference, the Religion Newswriter Association convention is going on. And I tuned in last night to watch the awards right before the keynote here, and was reminded of so many strong women: Emma Green at The Atlantic, Sarah Bailey at The Washington Post, Michelle Borstein at The Post, Elizabeth Diaz at The Times. I don't know why. Sometimes women may end up in certain beats because they're not seen as important, although I can guarantee you the religion beat is very important right now, as we're all talking about the Catholicism of the potential or prospective Supreme Court nominees. So what are the implications for the fact that we don't have a lot of women in these positions, or that women are lagging in this industry? I mean, obviously we need more women in these positions, not just because it's the right thing to do for justice reasons, but it also has practical implications, I believe. So it's no secret that young people are leaving churches, they're disaffiliating with institutional religion, and the rates of those disaffiliations are even higher among young women. In part, that's because people of a certain generation, younger people, distrust institutions more generally, and they're always looking for examples of hypocrisy and trying to see if there's a real integrity in some of these institutions. When we don't have equal representations on our staffs of all different people, I think younger people sense the hypocrisy, especially if you are claiming to be a publication that is for these things in your pages. So I think putting women on the staff doesn't necessarily, though, mean that women's voices will be heard, or that women's issues will be treated fairly, or women's equality will be advanced. I loved the image of muting and unmuting voices of women on this morning's panel. And I think, and I forget who said this idea that we don't need to speak for other women. We need to have, we don't need to be the voice for the voiceless. We need to have the voices there themselves so they can tell their own stories. I think in any industry, this would be really important, but it's especially important in the media because of the role that we have in controlling the narrative and the stories we tell. So when I think about the future, and I've been in this position of leadership for all of 4.5 months now, I know what's important to me, and I can share that with you just briefly. Since I became editor, I have made 5 hires on the editorial side, and 4 of them have been women. So it hasn't been hard for me to find qualified women to fill the positions that were open. The bigger issue that I face, and I face this every day in terms of not just hiring, but who is in our pages as writers and as sources, is having ethnic and racial diversity on our staff. The staff I inherited was nearly 100% white. And I find that if I don't make an effort specifically, if I just kind of accept what comes in or deal with people who have written for us in the past, I can end my week by saying, wow, I commissioned 8 pieces this week, and they're all by white men, usually, or maybe a few white women. And I don't think it's a coincidence that this panel is all white. It is true, right, that people tend to hire people like themselves, but we have to break out of that mold and really make a concerted effort to be able to change what what the staffs and the writers look like in media. And I think I'll just stop there. I know we'll have questions later, but that's how I'm looking to the future with this.
Thank you, Heidi. That was really interesting. Now we will turn our attention to Judith Valente. Judy?
Well, thank you, and a warm good afternoon to everybody. I'm honored, humbled really, to have been invited to give a few remarks amid all of these extraordinary women that we heard last night, this morning, and that we'll hear this afternoon. Thank you. My work is loving the world. That's the opening line of a poem by Mary Oliver called Messenger. And no words better describe how I've felt about my work as a messenger in both print and broadcast media. It was never merely a job or even a career, but a calling. I considered it a privilege to tell the stories of people, especially those who live on the margins of society, and to help them to speak for themselves, those whose voices are so often muted and ignored. At the Washington Post, I wrote about teenagers whose parents turned them over to the court system, claiming their children were, quote, uncontrollable. At the Wall Street Journal, I spent several months chronicling the story of a religiously conservative business executive quietly caring for his son dying of AIDS. At PBS, I had the moving experience of covering one of the first spiritual retreats for clergy sex abuse survivors, who, because of the compassion of the therapist leading the retreat, felt for the first time that they were truly being heard. And more recently, working for a national public radio station in central Illinois, where I now live, I was able to document how landlords were charging low-income renters excessive rents to live in crumbling, roach-infested apartments because they considered these tenants high risks. My work is loving the world. My vision of the role of the journalist comes largely from my experiences, my early experiences at both the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. Philip Graham, the legendary former publisher of the Post and the husband of Katharine Graham, used to say, journalists write the first draft of history. And one of my editors at the Journal would often quote Finley Peter Dunn, an early 20th century columnist for the Chicago Tribune. Dunn famously observed that a reporter's job is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Today, both statements can seem idealistic, even quaint. So drastically has public opinion of journalists changed. So I was deeply heartened a few months ago when a young writer named Benji Della Piedra contacted me about a book he's researching on a former editor of mine at the Post. And Benji said something I've kept turning over in my head. He referred to journalists as folk heroes, as people whose strength comes from their conscience and their wits. You know, Saint Benedict, the founder of Western monasticism, once said, ask the youngest members of a community what they think, because wisdom often comes from the young. And I thought to myself after talking with Benji, this young writer really gets what prophetic reporting is all about. Because Benji went on to say that he considers heroism a kind of improvisation, the ability to adapt to changing circumstances and to do something more creative than what you have done in the past. The ability to adapt to changing circumstances and do something more creative than what you have done in the past. As I look back over my career as a journalist, I witnessed many improvisations and encountered many prophets. When I arrived at the Post as a reporting intern at the age of 21, there were few women reporters assigned to the national desk that covered the prestige beats like the White House, Congress, and the Supreme Court. No woman was serving as a foreign correspondent. All of that would change within the 7.5 years I worked at the paper. Why? Because in the years before I arrived at the Post, a group of visionary women reporters had filed suit against the Post and Newsweek magazine, also owned by the Post, seeking to move women out of the feature section and into the news reporting and editing jobs that had previously been an all-male club. These women took a risk, not knowing if they would win the lawsuit or even if they would get to keep their jobs. They did both, and not a single day went by that I didn't feel gratitude for these prophetic women on whose shoulders I was standing. Over the years, I had the opportunity to work for many outstanding women editors who would play prophetic roles not only in journalism, but in society as well. One of my early mentors at the Post was Judy Valente. She would move from editing into writing one of the first columns in a national newspaper focused solely on women's issues. Judy showed, for instance, in her column, how fewer federal dollars were spent on breast cancer research than on research into less prevalent cancers and into AIDS. In another column, she proposed a ban on US funding for Egyptian hospitals that perform female circumcisions. And that practice in Egypt was eventually stopped. When I left the Post to work in the Wall Street Journal's Chicago bureau, my bureau chief was Sue Schellenbarger, one of those rare supervisors who cared as much about my personal development as my professional output. Under Sue's guidance, I was able to grow as a reporter, and the journal eventually offered me an assignment as a foreign correspondent in London, something that was barely possible for women just a generation older than me. Sue went on to write groundbreaking articles on how the modern workplace affects family life. Much has changed and improved since I began my journalism career. The women on this panel are superb examples of those changes. They are prophetic leaders in journalism today. But much still needs to change. Women still struggle. We are generally, as Heidi pointed out, underrepresented in top editorial positions, something especially true for women of color. We are often held to double standards. The Me Too movement showed how real sexual harassment is in the workplace, newsrooms included. But equally common are bullying bosses, bosses who speak to women in ways I don't believe they would ever speak to a male colleague. If we look at the prophets in Scripture, we have to acknowledge that they are ignored as often as they are heeded. And this is often true for journalists. But as the great Trappist monk Thomas Merton once wrote to a young activist, do not depend on the hope of results. Concentrate on the value, the rightness, the truth of the work itself. Concentrate on the value, the rightness, the truth of your work. And that has been my guiding principle. But there have been some changes in my own life. 2 years ago, my career took a different turn. I left daily journalism to focus on writing books on spiritual themes and leading retreats across the country. With journalism, I tried to change minds. Now I try to change hearts and minds. There was another important change. A reporting assignment led me a few years ago to visit several monasteries, and I became enamored of the contemplative rhythm of monastic life. And I'm now a Benedictine oblate, a lay associate of a monastery in Kansas. Being an oblate means incorporating the monastic values of listening, community building, and practicing hospitality of mind and heart in my daily secular life. Oddly enough, these were the same values that guided my years as a journalist. Only now I practice them through my books, by writing a weekly blog, contributing articles occasionally to US Catholic and other publications, and by returning to what had been my first love in writing, poetry. I can be more open now about my spiritual grounding, which is my Catholic faith, something I felt I had to keep under wraps working for secular media outlets. My most recent book, How to Live, is about incorporating monastic practices into secular life. And a new book, which will be out next year, is based on letters written to me over the years by a Trappist monk at Gethsemane Abbey, Thomas Merton's Abbey. So this is my new work, but in essence, my work is still loving the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judy. So we are at the point in the panel where I invite all of you attending the symposium to please send in your questions. A useful place to do that would be in the Q&A box. Megan is confirming for me that it's available to you. You can also try and use the chat function. As your questions come in, I just want to do a little bit of reflection on what we've just heard. First, Jessica related her experience in trying to find a voice in Catholic journalism. I love especially, Jessica, how you said you wanted to work for the incurably brainy, and how now that your career is broadening beyond the Catholic Church, how you see it as part of your mandate to let people raid the church for treasures. I think that all of your readers are going to be grateful for the way that you see your job in journalism. Then Heidi Schlumpf talked about her work both as a correspondent, a student of journalism, and then ultimately her work as an editor. Heidi, one of the things that you said that I appreciated was your quote of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, that women belong in all places where decisions are being made. And I think what you basically did in your presentation was to say that women across all racial and ethnic categories belong in all places where decisions are made. And really our job now is to figure out how to unmute those prophetic voices in the media world. And then lastly, Judy, in discussing her incredible career across so many platforms and institutions, Judy, I loved how you said that my work is loving the world, and how you brought our attention to the importance of improvisation, and how to be a prophetic journalist means that one has to be ready to do that. And you left us with this incredible idea, and that to write prophetically, you have to think about value, rightness, and truth in journalism. That will be on my mind for a long time, especially as we wrestle with the current challenges in the crazy media environment where we find ourselves, and we have to sort through all these different voices to figure out who really is telling the truth. And I think that that's a good way to guide our students and anyone else who is looking for ways to find the truth in the media today. So in the meantime, we've had questions coming in. So the first one here is from Kaya Oaks, and she asks, and this is for all the panelists, Do you suspect that the degree of misogynistic trolling and abuse women who cover Catholicism and Christianity regularly have to deal with will ever change? Or in your experience, has it gotten worse in the past 4 years, exacerbated by our needing to push out our work on social media? So has social media made it worse for you and for others? I'll let any of you take that.
I would actually really like to hear from Judith on this, if she faced that kind of criticism, you know, working in the secular media as a woman.
Well, oddly enough, it hasn't changed very much, because when I was at the Washington Post, you never said you were Catholic, because that would be to admit you were somehow intellectually defective. And these were highly educated people that I was working with at the Washington Post, very skilled people. But it wasn't just the Washington Post. I mean, just most recently in my last job at an NPR affiliate, NPR, you know, the news director said to me, he knew I liked to cover religion stories. And he said to me, I don't want you doing too many stories about the Catholic persuasion. And I thought, oh, really? It's a persuasion now? Catholicism is a persuasion now? But, you know, you hear these things, and do you react? You know, the struggle is, do you react to them? Or, you know, do you call out the person and then be accused of being, you know, arrogant or condescending or whatever, and whatever women are called when they fight back, or do you just sort of let it pass over you? I don't know what you all do, but you know, in terms of social media, I try to stay away from. I stay away from a lot of the, you know, the more caustic things that appear on social media. So I don't have to deal with that so much.
I mean, a lot of my experience is very, very online, and early on learned to stay away from comm boxes, or to ever read any commentary from Catholic men on my writing, because it's just notoriously abusive and horrible. So I just don't, as a rule, participate in that. But I'd love to hear, Heidi, if that's been your experience as well, working in Catholic media.
Yeah, so I'm on social media a lot, in the infamous Catholic Twitter, where things are pretty, there are a lot of trolling and a lot of negativity. And I'm trying to think about whether it's any worse for women, because it's just bad generally for everyone in terms of lack of respect. And, you know, I don't want to say there's no value in social media, because I have also made and kept friendships through it. But there is a lot of, you know, in our divided church and our divided country, there's a lot of people taking it out on one another on Twitter and other social media. Earlier this fall, or was it over the summer, I wrote a column in response to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's speech that she gave in reaction when she was not treated well by a Catholic man. And I put the rather, you know, catchy, you might say, headline on it, that AOC is the future of the Catholic Church. And I can tell you, I have never received so many death threats and hate mail as I did when I wrote that piece. And I'm pretty sure most people didn't read past the headline. You know, as a journalist, my skin is pretty thick. It doesn't, you know, it doesn't mean that much to me that somebody, you know, around the country wants to call me a baby killer or a socialist or whatever. I mean, they don't know me. They don't know my heart. But even I was a little taken aback at the number and viciousness of the letters and things that were said about me on social media and about her. And I think it has more to do with her femaleness than mine. She gets a very strong reaction.
That's really upsetting. And it also makes me realize that one of the problems that we're getting to about social media is that not only do these people not know you, Heidi or Jessica or Judy, but all anybody has to work with are, or they choose to work with, are headlines or these short tweets. You know, there's no context, there's no real relationship, there's really no sense that you're a human being and that you should be part of an ongoing conversation. You know, that people can just push a button and unload with all that anger, and it has to be. Go ahead, Jessica.
I would even say they're not done when they push the button. And this is one of the things in Catholic media and Catholic online life. They can really hurt you in real life. They can go after your job. They can call your parish. They can call your priest and say horrible things about you. They can call your bishop. And this happens all the time. If you work for a Catholic university, they can call your university president, your dean, and try to get you fired. And in some cases that has happened to colleagues of mine. And so it's trolling for women, I do think, is worse and more dangerous in Catholic media and in Catholic circles, because our livelihoods are really at risk when our position is already more tenuous than the men in the church. To have these people really viciously attack us often for things that are complete misrepresentations of our work and views, and the power that those trolls actually do have in our institutions is really frightening.
And
it's not just for Catholic media though. I mean, we used to get that too at NPR. You know, they'd call your boss, they'd call, you know, the head of NPR, you know, that sort of thing.
Well, sure, but can they get you in trouble with your church? Can it have a spiritual impact on your life to the point where you aren't able to speak in Catholic parishes anymore because your status as a Catholic in good standing has been called into question because there's been a troll campaign against your work? That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Like, it's multi-leveled. Yes, women have always been attacked and suffered for that in all spaces, but when your work is tied to your church, I feel like there's just a whole nother level there, and a whole other way of being abused and being at risk.
Yeah, and I guess I just wanted to piggyback on what you said, Michelle, though, because I also get letters from women and sometimes men who have been reading me for years and who say, you know, positive things about how, oh, you really helped me stay in the church, or thank God for NCR and your writing. And so, you know, they don't really know the real me either, but they're getting a totally different experience of my writing that's positive, and whether it's social media or just email is able to connect us as well. You know, when I was studying with Rosemary Radford Ruther, at the time I worked for the Archdiocese of Chicago for their newspaper, and she said to me, don't ever make your living from the church, because she knew that if you worked for an official Catholic institution, you were always sort of in danger of, you know, the hierarchy, you know, your priest or whatever, being able to say something. And when I was at US Catholic, I wrote an article that was a profile of 5 women who felt called to ordination, just telling their own personal experiences, not arguing it theologically. And the magazine ended up getting in trouble with the CDF, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And because they were owned by a religious order, it was problematic. But I was never worried about personally, like, what's the CDF going to do to me? I'm not a priest. I'm not a religious person. They can try and excommunicate me. I could have lost my job. The clerician stood behind me at the time. That's why I really like working for NCR. We're independent. So we are Catholic, but we're not tied officially to a church structure.
You know, it just reminds us that, number one, the church is not a democracy. The church does not have amendments to a constitution that guarantees everyone free speech, or at times necessarily values it, and kind of, I think, forces us to think about how to create a space for prophetic voices that can be protected, can be buffered from these institutional structures. I think possibly a space like this, NCR, but we definitely need more. Okay, I'm going to go on to another question here. from Mary Jo, who asks, what are the most important uncovered stories by the Catholic media today? Anybody want to take that?
Uncovered. Well, I tried to uncover a lot while I was reporting, and we're still doing that now. I think the story that we have been trying to tell, and of course NCR has this history which predates me of, for example, telling the sex abuse story long before anyone else was telling it, including long before the Boston Globe did. But what we've been trying to do the last couple of years is to talk about the money in Catholicism, and specifically the money that's funding conservative and right-wing Catholic groups, how they're interconnected, and the influence they have all the way up to the White House. And so I had done a number of stories like that. It started with my previous editor and some other writers who'd written about the Knights of Columbus. I'd written about EWTN, also about the Fellowship of Catholic University Students, or FOCUS. And our new national correspondent is going to continue in this vein doing those kinds of stories.
Well, here's
Anyone
one
else
story.
can?
Yeah, I mean,
Oh, go ahead.
I think the women in the diaconate. There was a big commission set up, and that was 4 years ago or so, and women are still sort of hanging on for that hope of being in the diaconate, of which there is ample theological grounding for women to be deacons. So that's one that's always bothered me, that there's we should be pushing that particular story and that particular issue.
Thank you for those answers. We have more comments and questions. Many people are thanking you for affirming much of what they've been experiencing. So just here's a comment here from another viewer. It seems to me that Christian media runs a wide gamut, but even when writing for secular publications to report on religion takes some degree of theological acumen and expertise. And the question that goes along with this is, when you do this work, to what degree do you think of yourselves as not only writers, but also as public theologians?
Well, I'll take a crack at that because I worked in secular media. I worked for a PBS show, which was a news show called Religion and Ethics News Weekly. The managing editor of that show, Bob Abernathy, and the anchor, he had gone to Yale Divinity School. But, Bob, even though he had that training, I mean, he really had a grounding in theology and theological studies, always felt that he just wanted really good reporters with him covering religion. I mean, he didn't think you needed a PhD or an MDiv or anything, but just to have that curiosity and that caring about covering religion. And I think the show did a pretty good job of covering religion, and I think that he picked pretty good people to do that. There were some people who had worked for NBC, some people like myself came over who had been at the Wall Street Journal. So I mean, I think a serious problem in secular media is that we're not covering religion really well. I mean, you mentioned, Heidi, a handful of the reporters who are covering religion on a regular basis. But, is there anybody at the NewsHour, for example, the PBS NewsHour, that regularly covers religion, or even NPR anymore? Some of their folks have retired that used to cover religion. So I think that's an issue. And then I want to just say one thing about the previous question about undercovered things. It really bugs me that, you have a Catholic running for president, somebody who's been a lifelong Catholic, a lifelong mass goer, and who's actually been, kind of been treated as an atheist, in some media circles. And I kind of wish that there was more about the grounding of some of these candidates who actually are practicing Catholics, and what that really means. So
yeah, I guess I'll give a plug for, we did a great piece on that. Our national correspondent Chris White did a really extensive piece about Biden's Catholicism. I do find, however, that I'm getting more media calls now that are interested in the people of praise because of Amy Coney Barrett and her, more unique way of practicing Catholicism in this covenanted community. I mean, on the issue of theologizing, I mean, I have a MTS, but I don't consider myself a theologian in my position. I got that degree in part so I could be a better journalist, in the same way that like a science journalist needs some scientific background so that they can, keep up with their sources. I leave the serious theologizing to people who do that for a living. That said, I'm a person of faith, and I don't pretend not to be Catholic. And I didn't pretend not to be Catholic when I was in a secular newsroom either. And it's partially how I got assigned religion stories, right? Schlumpf, you go to church, go cover this, But in working for Catholic publications, to me, that is one of the benefits, is that I don't have to pretend that I don't have my own faith life. And when I'm at an event, in fact, this happened to me. I was at an event that was, it was an election event run by mainline Protestants in Iowa. And I was with a secular reporter. And at one point there was, I can't remember if it was singing or praying, and I was participating. And he looked at me like I was odd, like as a journalist, I wasn't supposed to be doing that, right? Because I'm there objectively covering this event. But I'm able to do both, and I don't pretend not to be a person of faith.
Thank you. So we have several comments here, not really questions. One attendee notes that the struggles that are represented here on the panel remind her of another woman who was very nearly silenced for her religious views. This was Jacqueline Busey, who published Love Without Limits. The problem is widespread and underreported. Jessica, you're nodding your head. We don't hear you. Your mic's on, Jessica.
I actually blurbed that book. So yeah, we became friends over that topic. Being silenced by, your faith community for whatever, for having progressive views, for having the nerve to speak up and write books as a woman even, is not something that is limited to the Catholic Church by any stretch of the imagination.
Okay, we have a question here. Is anyone covering the USCCB's new introduction to their 2015 formation for figuring out how to vote? It is a striking update which allows for answering life values of various life matters like capital punishment, and calls for electing someone who is honorable and honest. Can anyone answer this?
I'm
Go ahead, Heidi.
Person is talking about the faithful citizenship document that the bishops have done for decades in advance of presidential elections. I think the news was last November that they chose not to do a completely new one, especially given how times have changed since it was last written. We have a new pope. It was under the last pope that the last version was written. And obviously our political situation is so different than it was 10 years ago. I think what they did instead is they did a letter that updated. It had sort of the old version of the document, but then this letter did include some language that talked about, like as this person said, some other life issues besides abortion. But there was a debate at that bishop's meeting about the use of the word preeminent to describe abortion as an issue, and that was voted to be included in that letter. And then I believe they did a series of videos or commercials. I remember the script for those videos being approved, that also did sort of list other issues that voters should consider. I mean, the real story there is how many people, I'm wondering on this call, have read Faithful Citizenship or use it in guiding their voting. Well, yeah, of course.
No. Don't use it to guide my vote, no.
Right.
Read it, yes.
I mean, I think it's important, and I think if the bishops had taken a stand and had done some real prophetic words in a new version of faithful citizenship, people would have stood up and listened. But the church leaders, unfortunately, the bishops in our country have lost so much credibility for various reasons that I'm not sure too many Catholics on either end of the spectrum are listening to their church leaders around who to vote for president or otherwise.
Well, that's why I think Sister Simone Campbell and people like Father James Martin, the Jesuit, are doing a good job using Twitter and using Facebook and social media to say, let's look at life issues. You know, life issues is a broad topic. It is not one single thing. And thank goodness for them, for their voices in our church.
I heard there's a great editorial at NCR today on this.
You're way ahead of me, Heidi.
Jessica, what do you think?
I think there are two different Catholic churches in this country. And to say like, oh, of course, being pro-life means something much broader than what some people say it means. It's much more than just abortion. We can all nod our heads and be like, yes, of course, we're on the same page there, but there are plenty of people in power in the church who will shut that down immediately and call into question your entire faith and standing as a good standing as a Catholic, which again, like I'm saying, that can mean you can't speak in parishes, which for some of us who our careers have been in Catholic media, you depend on speaking gigs to make money because you don't make money in Catholic media. So losing parish gigs is huge. So I almost feel like there's the intellectual Catholic world, there's the academic Catholic world, and even there you're gonna fall on one side or the other, depending what university community you're in. And then there's the reality that our church is very much behind the election of Trump in America. The American Catholic Church is definitely invested in having him reelected and pushing to overturn abortion laws. I mean, this is a fact. And I have a really hard time reconciling that. It's really lovely to be in communities of Catholics that are in agreement over this. But when I go out into the world and into my parish, that's not what I'm seeing in action. I'm seeing the stuff that I feel that I need to be fighting against, that I need to be speaking against. And the cognitive dissonance is really troubling to me, but something I feel like called to sit with and stay with as a Catholic. But I just want to acknowledge that it's real, and we will easily be dismissed for proclaiming the seamless garment of an entire pro-life teaching, which is what we believe our church teaches. There's plenty of people that believe that's not at all what our church teaches. And then it just becomes a theological war of who's right.
You know, there's something that hasn't come up, I'm surprised, in the questions, and that is, what is the Catholic Church going to look like after this pandemic, when so many people have been away from the church for a long time now, forcibly? I suspect there were a lot of people who just went rotely to Sunday Mass and just sat there, and now they don't have to do that because, you know, maybe they don't feel comfortable going back to Mass. But you know, how is that going to change, and what kind of effect is that going to have? Sister Carol kind of referred to this last night. You know, what's going to be the new normal in the church after, you know, all the churches are completely reopened and people aren't afraid to go to Mass who have pre-existing conditions. You know, I kind of feel in the pandemic, my prayer life got better because the churches were closed and I was more intentional about my prayer life. And I wasn't sitting listening to homilies that, you know, just made me angry or made me fall asleep.
There you go, right? It's easier to be a Catholic during the pandemic for me because I am able to zoom into masses that are not being held in parishes where they're preaching white nationalism from the altar and threatening people with going to hell if they vote for Biden. So I feel much more Catholic in the pandemic than I did before, and much more welcome in the church and much more hopeful about the church.
Yeah, I mean, I guess
Yeah.
I would just add that the institutional connection was already in decline before the pandemic. So I think when we see what's going to happen after, you know, what we used to call normal, I'm afraid we're going to see, you know, there are people who think, well, everyone's going to be so missing the Eucharist and the community that we're all going to rush back. And that might be a portion of Catholics. But I do think for a number of folks who are kind of hanging on by a thread to begin with, that's not going to be the case. And, you know, the only plug I can give for institutional connection is that people who don't see themselves as Catholic don't read the National Catholic Reporter. Okay, so they don't prioritize a Catholic school for their children or a Catholic university or even read maybe the Christian Century. So, and we've already talked about how sometimes these secular publications are not doing religion coverage in the way we would, and to the depth that we would like to see, in part because they're, you know, struggling with their own existence and decline. So I guess, you know, we want to reach the, you know, I think someone asked about the nuns. We want to reach the nuns. I think the nuns and people who are NONES, who are frustrated with the church as presented, the way you've described it, Jessica, people are excited when they find NCR and say, oh yeah, these are my kind of people. But if they don't see themselves as Catholic, they're not going to really attach to our progressive, you know, folks in the church either. And I do think that there's a need for community and kind of sticking together in some sort of way, but I don't claim to have any of the answers, that's for sure.
Uh-oh, Michelle, are you talking?
Michelle, you're muted.
One of our attendees sent an interesting article in Christianity Today that kind of answers some of these questions, well, with actual data about what's going to happen at the end of when people come back into brick and mortar churches. So I'm going to try and post this in the Q&A. It seems like it's actually using real social scientific data here to trace attendance shifts over time, etc. So I also, that kind of brings me to another comment here. One of the attendees is responding to something Judy and everyone else said, quote, I feel even in my experience of simple discussion groups, if I speak out and or voice my strong opinion, I always come away feeling I spoke too much or was defensive or just not being heard. I come away frustrated. That, I don't know about you, this resonates with me quite a bit. I personally, sometimes I feel hysterical, you know, if I am in either my actual church or a similar setting where I assume kind of a critical voice, as if it's not welcome in that particular community, that we're there mostly to affirm each other, to come to consensus, to listen. I would, you know, this is kind of my experience also sitting on parish council, which is a setting I value a great deal and the people there, but it is, you know, really not the place for us to have an opinion or to criticize. And so I think that we're, you know, made to feel that it's not our role. But so thank you, Patricia, for pointing that out.
And you easily become labeled as disrespectful, a troublemaker, condescending,
Yes.
arrogant, you know, things that if a man did it, those adjectives would not be there at all. So, you know, it's a fine line that we walk, and I was thinking about how do you deal with that? You know, how should I have dealt with that when I was in daily journalism? And I think we need to file complaints and we need to file lawsuits. And I never wanted to do that because I always had another opportunity to go on to, or I felt it wasn't worth my energy. And I think, Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, she doesn't do depression and she doesn't do regrets. And I try not to do regrets, but I think I could have done more. I could have done more when I saw those things that were obviously wrong. There's another good question in there, Michelle, about a person having history of reporting suspected child abuse in the church.
I just saw it. Yeah, this is in the comment section. This is a question, if you have a history or comment, if you have a history of reporting suspected child abuse in the church, you also are essentially a pariah in your own religion. This person says, I didn't feel I could publish anything, this person, a former journalist, but word got around that I had reported this. And the only reason I can still say I am Catholic is a good spiritual director and the Eucharist and a few other things. But it's been very difficult. So
I think this also speaks to the importance of another comment I saw come up about making space for other women's voices. And for those of us, I've seen it firsthand, how we become marked when we speak out. And if we don't continue to speak out and also to make space with our own privilege for other people to speak out and stand by them and support them, this will just continue to happen. That you'll be the lone voice in the wilderness calling out, and you will be the pariah, and you will become marked, whether it's in your personal parish or in your field. You'll become known as a troublemaker, somebody that, doesn't get hired for lectures or conferences or teaching opportunities or writing opportunities, because it is kind of a small world. So I really think it's important that we, again, in terms of making a voice for the liberal Catholic, for the left, the Catholic left, speaking up louder and gathering that momentum so that we can counter what is happening on the right that is so terrifying to most of us, I would assume. Making space for those voices and speaking alongside them and lending support is really important.
yes, amen. I'm going to pivot here for a second because there's another question. One of the attendees asks about diocesan newspapers. In her community in Iowa, they are going to cease publication of that newspaper. What do you think about diocesan newspapers and their role in the future of Catholic journalism?
Well, I might be willing to speak to that because I used to work for a diocesan newspaper, and I still read diocesan newspapers. I mean, the problem with diocesan newspapers and Catholic journalism in general is that we have massive change undergoing, like both of those, industries, if you want to call it that. So journalism is undergoing this massive change. We have decline of local journalism, in the secular world as well. And so it's not surprising that it's happening in diocesan newspapers, which are kind of like the equivalent of local Catholic publications. And then we also have all of these change going on in the church, not only kind of the move rightward, but the constriction and the money problems that are flowing out of, fewer people and lack of giving and everything else, and parish constriction and all that kind of stuff too. And so there isn't money for dioceses to support running a newspaper. So a lot of diocesan newspapers were started back when Catholics couldn't be treated fairly in secular media. So they had their own newspapers and they were run by the diocese. Most diocesan newspapers today, or at least many of them have been moving towards this for a while, are really more communications and PR vehicles than they are actual journalism. And so that's something that the diocese can justify spending money on, because every organization needs to do communications. But that's not the same as journalism. And so I think we're just going to continue to see the decline of that. And I'm saddened by that, but also we have to accept the reality and ask, what can we do going forward in terms of new media and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. We've had some other questions that some of which I don't really quite understand.
I just add one more comment?
Oh,
Talk.
actually, I just found a question. This is a difficult question, but it bears asking. Does the single issue voting against abortion help people to hide their racism and xenophobia? They can vote for someone who will mass deport people and encourage white nationalism, and do so while claiming to be good Catholics. You know, I've thought about this, but I want to hear your answer. So the idea of abortion as a shield.
Absolutely. It's the first criticism you're going to get if you bring up any of those other issues as a writer. The first comment you're going to get from a Catholic is going to be, but abortion. And I do think that we're using abortion as an issue to deflect from having to discuss racial justice and from having to care about family separation at the border and immigration policy, because we can always hold up this movement within our church that has completely usurped our entire church, which is the pro-life movement. It's like the only thing people identify with Catholicism in America anymore. And people aren't even aware of the vast scope of Catholic social teaching. And it seems like they're not aware of it within our own church, but I think that's disingenuous. I think that it's absolutely a ploy. So I completely agree with that read on the situation. Yeah, we are using it again and claiming ourselves to be good Catholics and using it as a weapon against our fellow Catholics.
You know, I've also thought about this in my own work as a historian of American politics and American religion. And it strikes me that one change that we've seen over time is, especially with the emergence of the abortion single issue, is that those of us who identify as progressives, as reformers, and who embrace like a wider vision of life, we often don't come into the public sphere identifying as Catholic voters or Catholic this or Catholic that. I don't know if people kind of see it this way, but that we often kind of divide ourselves. There's the Catholic private side, which is, you know, your religious family life. And then there is your professional, political, or public side. I'll never forget, I went to a lunch with a colleague at the Newberry Library, and we were talking, and she said to me, you know, I'm Catholic. I forget how she said it, but she was almost sheepish about it, like to identify herself in that setting, that professional setting, as Catholic. And we've really bonded over it ever since, because, you know, unlike me, I work at a Catholic university, so it's not that uncommon, but in other realms, it's really not felt to be appropriate. In that way, I feel like the religious right, the Catholic right, has kind of stolen that, that thunder and that power. And it's another reason maybe why abortion as a single issue has been such a force.
Well, I don't disagree with what you said, Jessica, except to say that it's being used as a shield implies a level of intentionality that I'm not sure is there for all pro-life voters. My colleague, Michael Sean Winters, uses the term totem, that abortion functions as a totem. It stands in for all kinds of other things. So if you're pro-life about abortion, a lot of people kind of then can say, oh, you're like me. You kind of are coming from the same cultural space that I'm coming from. And that for some people that is about racism, or it is about, you know, going back to like a 1950s kind of idealized make America great, you know, kind of thing. I you know, am lucky because of the path that I've taken in my career. I proudly claim being Catholic in both my professional and my personal lives. And I don't want to let, you know, the religious right have the exclusive claim on that. So I understand that people who work in different industries, though, have to make other choices.
Yeah, I would describe most of academia, including history, as being very secular. Well, I could go on. But we have some other questions here, and we have about 4 more minutes. First, based on what we're discussing, it seems women need supportive community to use our voices more strongly. I agree with Heidi that the right is very strong and aggressive, and we need to counter that with strong, passionate voices based on the gospel's message of radical love and acceptance. Any suggestions as to how we can support one another in developing these voices?
I feel like I've devoted most of my career to trying to develop those voices and to give them space. The problem is that we don't have access to a readership. And I don't know where to publish that work. I don't know where, except for, as has happened to me, in Protestant magazines and magazines that are, you know, interested in Catholicism and not opposed to it really, but, and like, it's kind of a fascinating thing. And so they'll publish something by a left Catholic. I don't know how to reach the audience. And without, you know, Sick Pilgrim was a very shoestring volunteer operation. And we did a lot for what we had, but we were always looking for a donor or an investor or someone who could help us to launch something that would have more reach and more permanence. And we would just come up against walls looking for grants, looking for opportunities. So that is where I get hung up. I don't know how to say this any better, but like the religious right has a lot of money. They're very well funded and they can get their message out there. And I'm not sure how to do that without money. It's just the reality of publishing. So we can support each other, we can publish each other's words, we can amplify voices, but we need leaders to take charge and create the spaces, the people who have resources and privilege, to take their resources and privilege and create spaces for these voices so that they can reach a wider audience.
Totally agreed. But it does also remind me of the Catholic worker and how there was just no money there.
Right.
You know, month to month, somehow they managed to develop a space for so many important voices. So it's one of those things that gives me hope, but I think you're absolutely right about the power of money. Heidi, you wanted to say something?
Well, I would just say one thing about social media and about the internet is that anyone can publish. Now, like you said, you have to find the audience, but there are people who have, you know, are not connected to a publication who have found broad audiences. I'm also going to say this, and I hope I won't regret it, but I encourage everyone listening, if they have something to say, to pitch to me, because I publish women at my publication. I have constraints and I have to make journalistic decisions, and I can't say yes to every single thing because there is a cost to everything that we publish. But I will prioritize voices of women and people of color in submissions that come to me. So, you know, pitch to me.
Yes, same for my role at the Christian Century. Please send pitches.
Thank you. I actually think that's a wonderful way to close our panel, that to remind people that you do have opportunities. There are outlets out there, and that the editors here, the writers, they want to hear from you. What you have to say is very important, and as I can tell from reading the chat and Q&A windows, very interesting. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, organizers. Thank you to our predecessors in the symposium for giving us so much inspiration and ideas to talk about. I look forward to our final panel of the day. And so I'm going to say goodbye and see you all in, I guess, about 30 minutes, Megan?
No, the final panel, thanks, Michelle. The final panel of the day is going to start at 3:30 actually. So that's in 14 minutes. So
Sorry, yes.
no, that's all quite all right. Take a break. We're looking forward to hearing about conversation among colleagues. Let's rethink Catholic social teaching. And I'm gonna share a screen so you can look at a preview of that. Thanks very much, everyone.